coming to class. So this is week 7 of the quarter, and the rest of the week, the rest of the quarter is arranged as follows. This is week 7. Today we'll be covering about display, and then week 8 and 9 are about solar. I've divided them into crystalline and thin film, and the last week is LEDs. And though they may seem very, very disconnected devices, but there's some commonality between all these devices. And one of the common themes is they have to do something with light, right? These display and LEDs have something to do with getting light out of the device, and for these solar technologies have something to do with getting light in and converting it into electricity. So today is about displays, and for the major part of last decade, what was happening in this field was just things were getting bigger, and bigger was better, and most of these displays are measured diagonally. And the reason they're measured diagonally is that it's a legacy from the days of the CRT display, where you used to have cathode ray tubes, and there will be, bulging out and being circular or being spherical in space. So if you need to compare two of these CRTs, the only way you could compare them was to measure it diagonally. So that would take into account the curvature of that CRT tube. But there's no reason to measure it diagonally nowadays. It's more accurate that you actually give the resolution or the dimension on both sides, but still that legacy has carried on. And the largest display you can buy currently is this 84-inch diagonally. It sells for quite a lot, and you can buy it in Korea currently. And not only were these displays getting bigger, but the tools for making them were getting bigger too. And this is a tool, that Applied Material currently sells, and the different generations of them, Gen 8, Gen 9. Currently, I think they're at Gen 11 or Gen 12. And each of them, essentially, they were tools which are capable of processing a bigger and bigger glass. So you would make actually 4 or 5, not 4 actually, maybe 8 or 10 of these displays from one piece of glass. So that piece of glass were getting bigger and bigger. And so these tools, if you look at them, these are humongous tools. You can see a person standing next to it. I've been into one of these. You can essentially stand up, invite your friends over, have a barbecue inside the chamber. It's that big of a chamber. But with the post-PC era, this has started to change. The trends in display is no longer about just being a bigger display, but it's about the displays you have in your smartphones and tablets, and the requirements are very different. The requirements are power, the requirements is color, the requirements on resolution are much higher, and we will delve into those today. But this is what an ideal display should be. It should be easy on your eyes. It should display full motion. It should display videos. It should display color. It should be rollable, and it should use precious little power. Right? That's what we want all our displays. That's a wish list for an ideal display. Also, if you follow some of the product announcements, you'll see terms like these being thrown around. For example, this is the iPhone 4 announcement. It says it has 4x more pixels than the previous generation. The pixel density is 326 pixels per inch. The contrast, it says, is 800 to 1. It uses the IPS technology. What is IPS technology? Same thing. If you look up the iPhone 5 specs, it will have terms like this: 800 to 1 contrast ratio, brightness of 500 candela per meter square. So what does it mean, and what are the benchmarks for some of these numbers? So here's that in more detail. If you go look up iPhone 5 display spec, it says IPS LCD technology. So again, what is IPS? Say the sRGB color gamut. What is the sRGB color gamut? Say this much is enough to call it a retina display. Say the gamma of 2.2. What is this gamma of 2.2 means? Say the contrast of 800:1. Is it a good enough contrast? Do I need more than this? Say the brightness of 500 candela per centimeter square. So again, what are all these numbers? Does any of you understand all of these numbers? What do they mean? Or okay, good. So we have something to learn today in the next 80 minutes or so. And ignorance was bliss. Now since I've thrown these terms around, you would want to compare them from a competing device, right? So if you compare a Galaxy S3, it says Super AMOLED or active matrix OLED display. It says it has a much bigger color gamut as compared to the iPhone 5. It has a lower resolution as compared to the iPhone 5. So first of all, why is it lower? Say the gamma is between 2.2 and 2.4. Apparently, it has a much bigger contrast. So why does it have this much bigger contrast? It's the contrast is more than 20 times more than 10 times less compared to your iPhone 5. Say that has a much lower brightness. It has half the brightness of your iPhone 5. So again, what do these numbers mean? How do we? What is enough? What is more than needed? What is actually more marketing than actual spec? So we will delve into that today. But before we do that, we need to understand some of those terms in the last slide. We first need to understand how does human vision work, or how do we perceive all these things? How do we perceive brightness? How do we perceive color? What is the resolution of our eye? What is the maximum contrast we can perceive? So we need all these tools and to understand all those numbers on the previous slides. And more importantly, you'll see that if you understand these, you can actually manipulate or operate your displays in such a way that you can actually manipulate or leverage the way your human vision works. So let's start with understanding first of all how does human vision work. So this is not a recent question. People have been asking, or the first thing we as a species always wanted to do is find out more about ourselves. So dating back all the way up to Newton, he was trying to understand how does our vision work. And so this is a very simple experiment that he did in 17th century, and what it involved was you pass sunlight through a prism and it splits into a set of colors. If you pass through it a second prism, it does not split into these set of colors. And what another experiment that he did for the follow-up of this experiment was to then combine these different colors and combine them using another set of prisms, and then he could regenerate that light. Right? So this, as we all know, is essentially splitting the light we can see into this visible spectrum, and this is the visible spectrum that our human eyes can see between 400 to 700 nanometer, which is exactly the same as the color in your rainbow as well. And the way our vision works is that we have these things called cones and rods. Rods are responsible for giving us the brightness, and cones are responsible for giving us the color that we perceive. And usually, people in biology, they have a very creative imagination when they name things inside the body, but apparently they followed a very simple convention, and these cones are essentially called as LMS cones, standing for long, medium, and short wavelength cones. So a long wavelength cone would be this red cone, a medium wavelength cone would be your green cone, and a short wavelength cone would be your blue cone. And essentially, if you look at the spectral response of your eye to different colors, it would form a locus like this. And so to give some more color on that to speak, so if you have any particular response or any particular spectrum hitting the pupil of your eye, you have these three different cones. One is a blue cone, one is a red cone, and one is a blue cone, a green cone, and a red cone. And what these cones do is they have these spectral response, and you essentially just take an integral of those two curves, and this is what your L cones perceives. This is your M cone, that is your medium cone, and that is your S cone. And what our human eye perceive is essentially just an integral of this power spectral density under these three different cones, which are also given by these numbers rho, gamma, and beta. So those are the only three numbers our human eyes cares for as far as color is concerned. That as long as you have two different objects, they give the same rho, gamma, and beta numbers, our human eye will perceive them as the same. So again, so you have rods which give you the intensity of the light, you have cones which give you the color, and if you look at the density of these cones, not more than, but around 2/3 of these cones are just red cones and they detect red light, and 1/3 of them are green cones, they detect green light, and less than 2% of our cones are blue cones. So we have very few blue cones, but they are very sensitive. And another important term to understand is this term called as metamers. So this is very essential to understanding any display, and this is what enables any display technology, that our eye perceives two different colors as the same as long as they give the same rho, beta, and gamma numbers. So you could have these two different colors, and they could have very different spectral distribution. One could be very wide, one could be less wide, but as long as they give the same integral for your red, green, and blue colors to your eye, they would appear exactly the same. And this is what enables essentially all of these display technology. You can take three colors, you can just take three primaries, and as long as you combine them in a way such that they give the same rho, beta, and gamma numbers, your eye will perceive them essentially as the same colors. And that's why you can use just three colors in your LCD or three LEDs and make any display. Another very important thing to understand, and you'll see this later, a lot of people are trying to leverage this now, is that our eye is much more sensitive to green than it's to blue and red. So, you use green laser pointers. If you use a green laser pointer versus if you use a red laser pointer, you might have seen, you see the green laser pointer much more brightly. And this is a fact that is used very heavily in OLEDs, and the way these OLED displays are laid out or designed is it uses heavily this fact that our human eye is much more sensitive to green, and I'll give more details on that when we just talk about OLEDs. So what our human eye perceives, the different range of these colors can be plotted into this thing called as a color gamut, and this is essentially all the colors that we can perceive. And all these display has to center that gamut with respect to one point. So again, there's a lot of parallelism between photography and display over here. So if any of you have used a camera, you essentially choose a white balance point, which is the reference to which you center your whole color gamut. And that reference point, typically for, if you do photography, you choose this D50 reference point, which corresponds to 5,000 Kelvin, or it's essentially 1/3 of red, 1/3 of blue, and 1/3 of green. Sometimes you also choose this 6,500 500 Kelvin, also known as D65 point. But most of the displays we'll talk about, they choose this point called as 7500. So all of these displays on your smartphones or your tablets, they have a bluish tint because they have a shifted white balance. And most of these displays, they don't cover the whole color gamut, so they cover a subset of that. And so the subset of this color gamut is this triangle, and this black triangle over here, it's called the standard RGB display, or your RGB color gamut, which is, roughly half the area, or a fraction of this area of this color gamut. And that's what most of your images are stored at, and that's what most of your cameras record, and that's what most of your displays operate at. And we'll see when we discuss about LCD or OLED technology, they each have a different gamut. Also, this color is, it depends a lot from person to person, from gender to gender. And I was, a few months back, I was talking to this person, Julie Brown. She's a CTO of UDC, and we're discussing OLED displays, and I told her, why would anybody want OLED display for a TV? That LCDs are so cheap. Why? They're bright. Why would you want OLED? He said, Anish, have you looked at OLED display? The black is really black. How can you not want a OLED display? So again, it depends a lot from your perception of one person to another. And the other thing is the resolution that our human eye has. So it depends upon what is the acuity of your pupil, but typically for an acuity of 1.7, our human eye can resolve between 0.3 to 0.5 arc minute. And this is again given by that simple formula, the angle that any feature of a height h subtends at a distance d is just the tan inverse, twice the tan inverse of that. So if you hold something close, you essentially need more resolution. So if you look at your displays, they have essentially even less pixels than what your iPhone or your iPad have. And that depends upon, because you hold your smartphone much closer to your face than what you hold a tablet, and then what you hold as compared to how far you sit from your television. Of course, you don't hold the television in your face. So you need much less display on a thing if you hold it far away from it. So that requirement of half arc minute, if you put it into that formula and substitute a D of 10 inch, it essentially comes out to be anything which is more than 300 pixel per inch placed at a distance of 10 inch away. You can't distinguish between the individual pixels. So that's what Apple has a marketing term for it called retina display. But the same analogy, if you apply to if you hold your tablet, the operating point for a tablet is 15 inch away from your face. And so that resolution required for a tablet is 250 pixel per inch if you hold it 15 inch away. So most of your iPads and even the Google Nexus 10, they have a resolution which they try to always exceed 250 pixel per inch. So if you look at this figure, where should the mini iPad be, or where should the 7-inch tablet be? What resolution should it have? So between 250 and 300, right? But actually it's not. So if you look at the iPad mini, it has a resolution of 163 ppi. One way to look at it is that it's a compromised product. You want to make it cheap. That's why you didn't give it a very good display. But probably more probable reason is that they wanted to keep the same resolution in terms of exactly half the resolution of your iPad, or the same as your second generation iPad. So the only way you can fit that resolution in an 8-inch screen is that you you get the resolution requirement from there. So, but it's not the optimal display. It's not a retina display, or you could still distinguish between individual pixels. Another very important feature for our eye, which is responsible for this term called gamma, is that our vision is not linear with intensity. That is, that's again a vestige from our days of our species as a hunting species, as a predator species, because we used to, when you hunt, you're in night light, you want to have a much better response to lower light conditions. So our response to the intensity in light is our eyes are much more responsive at low light conditions, and then as compared to when they are at bright light. So if you plot our, the output function as a function of this input, it would have an exponent which is called as gamma, and this exponent is more than 1. Actually, this exponent is 2.2. So our eye, it responds much more to low intensity of light, and so it has much higher intensity here. So you can see this is a straight line, and this is a power function with an exponent of 2.2. And that's why, it's our gamma for our eyes is 2.2, and that's why most of the displays have to adapt to that. And so that's why when we store image, so our camera or our image sensor, it has a linear response function. Number of photons that it records, it just depends upon how many. It just depends linearly on the intensity of the light that hits that sensor of your camera. But when you actually store the image, you do something called as gamma encoding. So if you look at it, that's your original image, and so that's linear encoding. But then you divide it. You take a log with a base of, and then you store it like that. So that's what gives you more granularity in your image. So this is a raw image which your camera. So if you store it as a raw image in your camera, it's just stored as it is. But if you store it as a JPEG, it encodes it and stores it with this gamma of 2.2. And then you have to do this decoding back when you want to display it. So when you want to display image, then again you need to multiply it by that exponent again. So that's what most of as far as display is concerned, they mostly multiply this image by this function, and most of the displays nowadays, they multiply this with this gamma of 2.2. Some of the Mac and Macs, they multiply it by a gamma of 1.8, and that gives you a brighter image. But 99% of the displays, all your smartphone displays, your tablet displays, they try to achieve a gamma of 2.2. Not always, but that's what they try to achieve. So another thing we need to understand is how much is the contrast of our eyes. So again, the dilation of our pupil actually increases our contrast quite a bit. So this contrast is measured as f-stop, or f-stop of 8 means you have a resolution of you have a contrast of 2 to the power 8, or f-stop of 16 means that you have a resolution of 2 to the power 16. So our human eye, including the dilation of the pupil, it has a resolution of, it has a contrast of 2 to the power 24, or a f-stop of 24. But at a constant or at a normal light kind of dilation of your pupil, that contrast is still 12 to 14 f-stop. So that's a very high resolution. So that's our human eye it can resolve up to a contrast of 10,000. We saw the iPhone 5. It has a contrast of 800. So again, our eye can distinguish much better than what the current displays operate at, especially the what the LCD displays operate at. how do I define contrast? I define contrast as the maximum intensity of my image divided by the minimum intensity of my image. So a final thing I want to understand is, the spatial resolution of our, or the time resolution of our eye. And to understand that, the best way to understand is, please stare at this thing for 30 seconds. So, if I could have your attention, please, stare at it for 30 continuous seconds. Okay. So now stare at this. So how many of you saw after image after? Okay. So our eye has, it takes time to refresh. It's not, if you fill it up, especially if you oversaturate your cones with a particular color of light, it has a finite time response. And so if you keep looking at some figure, and if you place a white background out of that, you see essentially a reciprocal image of that. You see exactly opposite color of that, because your cones are saturated with that previous image. And the minimum that we have to perceive continuous motion is between 16 to 24 frames per second. Most of the displays, most of the signal that you see in your TV, it has a frame rate of between 50 to 60 frames per second. Some of the really advanced games, like if you have played, how many of you have played Quake 3? So Quake 3 has a frame rate of 150 hertz or 150 frames per second. And most of the HD TVs that you buy today, they have either a frequency of 60 or 120 hertz. Some of the really best ones have a refresh rate of 240 hertz. And I'll talk to you later that if you are using LCD display, which currently uses amorphous silicon backplane, or it uses amorphous silicon thin film transistor, that's the maximum frequency you can get with amorphous silicon transistor. So if you want a higher, better refresh rate for as more than 240, which is, it gives you a more more continuous motion, especially or only important when you're playing some of these games, then you need to move to this move away from amorphous